How are you? Today I'm going to talk about Symfony 4. Not everything about Symfony 4, not about the new features, but more about the philosophy behind the new version and some cool stuff. But first, so I have two ways of doing the presentation, talking about theory and why we made some decisions, or I can do a demo. Whatever works for me, tell me. Who wants some theory and slides? Boo. Who wants a demo that is not going to work? Okay, thank you. Okay, let's do that. I can switch back to the slides if that doesn't work. So perhaps I can still start with a slide, perhaps this one. So Symfony 4 is going to be released at the end of November this year, so in about 2 months from now. And Symfony 4 is very different from Symfony 2, Symfony 3, and of course Symfony 1. So Symfony 1 was really about monolithic applications and a lot of magic, really. And I like that a lot. Symfony 2 was very different, but it was still, so it was about decoupled components, but also still like a full stack framework that you need to download to start working on something. Symfony 3 introduced the notion of a micro framework with the kernel trait that you can use, and it was just the beginning of starting to go away from the full stack framework, but still, whenever you start an application with Symfony 3, you need to get all the components and all the bundles that are part of the Symfony/Symfony repository. With Symfony 4, that's very different again. The components are exactly the same. The bundles are also exactly the same. But now you can think of Symfony more as being a platform that you can use to develop applications. Not just big applications. It works also with microservices, APIs, web services, and so on. And of course, it was possible to do that with Symfony 3, but the needs depend on the kind of applications that you want to develop with Symfony. You don't need the same dependencies, the same bundles, the same components if you are developing an API or a web application or a microservice-oriented application. The needs are different, but today, the best way to start a new application is to start with the Symfony Standard Edition that you probably get from the Symfony installer directly, or you can download that from the Symfony website as well. Which means that you get a bunch of stuff that you might need, but you probably don't need all the things that are part of the Symfony Standard Edition. That's what you get by default when you install a new project with the Symfony Standard Edition. More than 40 components, some external libraries, and a bunch of bundles. That's the default. Of course, you can remove some of the stuff. You can edit the composer, the JSON file, and remove some of the dependencies that you don't need. But by default, that's what you get. I'm not sure you are using everything. And if you are not using the form component, for instance, because you are developing an application that has no forms, or if you are developing an API, you get a bunch of code that you are not going to use. Is it a problem? Probably not. It's all about perception, really. It feels like heavy with a lot of things. And the other problem is that just because the form component comes by default, Symfony enables the form subsystem by default, which means that if you are doing nothing, if you are not configuring your project, you get the default configuration from Symfony Standard Edition, you get the form framework enabled by default. And it's up to you to actually switch it off if you don't need the form framework. That's kind of a problem. That's the number of lines, the number of lines of code you have in the vendor directory when you create a new project with Symfony 3.3 with the Symfony Standard Edition. That's a bunch of code, really. And now let's switch to Symfony 4. So the philosophy of Symfony 4 is very different. By default, we want you to be able to start with a minimal set of dependencies, the bare minimum, the things that you need, the core framework, the things that all applications need. So probably HTTP Foundation, because you need some kind of way to communicate with HTTP anyway. HTTP kernel, of course, as well, and some other components, but not that many, really. And I'm going to switch here right now. OK, and that's what you get with Symfony 4 by default. Less code, less components, less bundles. That's a reduction of 70%, which means that by default, you don't get the form framework, for instance. And the form is really just an example. Which means that it is not enabled by default. And that's the big difference between Symfony 2, Symfony 3, and Symfony 4. By default, everything is disabled. And it's up to you to add more dependencies. And whenever you want to work with a form, you can require the form component, and it's going to be enabled by default. So it's the exact opposite from Symfony 3. In Symfony 3, you get the form framework. It is enabled by default. With Symfony 4, it is disabled because it's not installed by default. But whenever you install it, it's enabled right away. You don't need to configure it in any way. Again, Symfony Standard Edition. And that's what you get with Symfony 3.3. With Symfony Flex, we're going to talk about Symfony Flex in a minute. And if you are using the same thing with Symfony 4, you get even less components, libraries, and bundles. That's the bare minimum. We can't really remove anything more than what you have here on the screen. OK, let's go to the demo now. So if you want to create a new project with Symfony 4, and everything I'm going to talk about today is you can do the same with Symfony 3.3. It's going to work, right? And actually, I'm going to create a new Symfony 3.3 project, not a Symfony 4.1. We wanted to use all the standard things that come from PHP. So the first thing is Composer. So instead of having a Symfony installer, you can use just Composer. You create a new project. And the project is Symfony Skeleton. And then I'm going to pass directory. So it's going to be fast because everything is in the cache, hopefully. OK, done. And if I go to the demo directory, I can see the default directory structure, which is a bit different from what you get with Symfony 2 and Symfony 3. So the first big difference is that you don't have a web directory, but a public one. You can see that I have only one file under public, which is index.php. So we have only one front controller. And I'm going to talk a bit about that in a minute and why we only have one. And as you can see, I don't have any icons or 5 icons or the robots.txt file or anything, just one file. So it's really the bare minimum that you need to get started. Then you have a source directory. That's the same as before. You can see that the kernel is here in the source directory. There is no app directory, and config is actually almost the same as what you get in Symfony 3 under the app config directory. You can see that the names are very different here. We're going to talk about that. And you can see that I have a packages directory here with a bunch of files in there. So let's have a look at what we have under Symfony Skeleton. Nothing. The skeleton is really just a composer.json file, nothing more. And in there, you can see the default dependencies. And so we only have 3 of them. The first one, Symfony Flex, is what makes Symfony 4 works. And all the magic is actually contained into Symfony Flex. So we're going to talk a lot about Flex today. The second one is the framework bundle. And framework bundle depends on a lot of components. Not a lot of components, but some components like HTTP Foundation and the routing subsystem and the kernel and things like that. YAML is there because the configuration is written in YAML, but it's not needed, but it's nice. And by default, SymfonyFlex is going to configure your application with YAML files, so that's a requirement. And then we have one development requirement, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. And that's all. That's all. And as you can see here, by default, the license is a license that works well with the project that you're going to create. You're not going to use the MIT license for your projects, probably not. So it is really optimized for a project that you're going to start and not an open source one. So, which means that instead of doing what I've done, I'm going to remove that. What I can do is I can create a demo directory by hand, and I can't. Why? Really? Ah, that's why. Okay, I can get this composer.json file, paste, and then composer install. That's exactly the same as before. So you don't need to use composer create project. You can just composer install. All the magic comes from the SymfonyFlex component, which is really a composer plugin. Right? So if I have a look at the demo again, same set of files. Right? So if we have a look at the output of the composer install, you can see that it installs a bunch of dependencies. And then you can notice that this is new, probably new for you. And that's what makes magic works, and that's what Flex actually does. So first, so you can see that the first dependency that was installed was SymfonyFlex, and then Flex hooks into the composer logic to actually do more than just installing dependencies. So for some of the components that we installed, you can see that it configured things. And configuring means creating files, configuring Symfony stuff, adding some environment variables, for instance, and things like that. So it can do a lot of different things, and that's why I get all those files here, just because it's configured for each dependency. So let's have a look at the Symfony framework bundle first. So the way it works is that Flex see that you want to install Symfony framework bundle. It connects to the Symfony server, and then on the Symfony server, we have a look for what we call a recipe to install the Symfony framework bundle. There is a recipe for framework bundle. It's then used by SymfonyFlex locally to do things. And the recipes are part of a repository that is named Symfony/recipes. And if we have a look at Symfony framework bundle, this is a recipe. So this is the logic to install and configure framework bundle. And the configuration is really a default configuration that should work for 90% of the use cases out there. So you can make some changes, you can tweak the configuration, but by default, it's going to do things the right way. So the first file I want to have a look at is the manifest. And the manifest is really the definition of the recipe. So you can see that I want to register a bundle, which is framework bundle. All means all environments, development, test, and production. We want to copy some files under config, public, and source. We add some composer scripts, more on that in a minute, and we can register environment variable. And I'm not sure if you are aware of that, but as of Symfony 3.3, we have a new component, .env, and it lets you manage environment variables. And in Symfony 4, most of the configuration that depends on the environment, not the Symfony environments, but the deployment environment, can be managed by setting some environment variables. So you can see here 3 default ones that needs to be installed with framework bundle, app env, debug, and a secret. And then, as you can see, we also manage some files for you, like the git ignore. And that means that here, if I go back here, I go to demo, I can say git init, git add dot, and it only adds the relevant files. That's nice. You don't need to configure that. It's done automatically. As you can see, I have a very limited set of files by default, not 1,000 of them. And you can see the .env.dist file, which is really what we have in the recipe. Right? You can see that we can have dynamic stuff here because the secret was automatically generated when we did Composer install. So you're going to have a different one whenever you create a new project. And automatically, the .env file was created. That's the one you're going to use, or Symfony is going to use in the development environment. And of course, in production, you would need to use real environment variables. OK, you can see that we also have a make file. So this one is kind of nice because by default, we don't have the console. Right? If you have a look, there is no bin directory. There is no console. There is no web server. So you can't use the built-in web server that we have in Symfony 3. It's available, and I'm going to show you how to install that. But by default, it's not there. So how can you start with Symfony? With the make. So if I say make serve, it's going to use php-s to run the web server. And you can see that it is recommended to require the Symfony web server bundle if you want to have a better web server to work with. So let's do that. I'm going to say composer require. First, I want to work with a console. So I can say console like this. And you know that console is not a valid identifier for a composer package, right? It should be Symfony/console. And as you can see here, it actually installs Symfony/console. And that's something that comes with Flex. I told you that Flex actually hooks into the lifecycle of Composer. And one of the things it does is trying to understand what you want to do. So I can remove a console really fast. And we have this concept of aliases. So I can say require CLI, for instance. I'm going to do the exact same thing. Because it knows that CLI means console means Symfony/console. Right. Now that I've installed the Symfony console, I can see that now I have a console under the bin directory here. It's done automatically. And you can see that here, after doing some installation and the Symfony operations, it did execute some scripts. And those are configured under composer.json. And if we have a look at here, you can see we have some things. So whenever we install or we require a new dependency, it's going to warm up the cache. So it's going to clear the cache and then warm up the cache. It is using make because we abstract the fact that the console is installed or not. So it's going to work even if the console is not installed. And then we install some assets. And each recipe can add things here. So a recipe is really about several things. It can install files. It can configure the make file. It can add things under the git ignore file. It can add things under the composer scripts section. It can register some environment variables and more. So that's the work you don't need to do. And the default configuration is really a good set of defaults. OK, now let's install Composer I don't know, web server like that. Doesn't work because that's require. Okay? Yes, that works. Just because I have an alias. And now if I say bin console, I have server run. But as you can see, I don't have that many commands. Again, just because I don't have a lot of dependencies. If you want to learn more about all the aliases that are available, you can go on symfony.sh. That's the Symfony Flex web server. That's the one we communicate with when we install dependencies. And here you can see all the available recipes, really. And if you want to have a look at, I don't know, I want to work with an API, you can say API, you can see that it's going to install API pack. And you can see all the aliases. So you can say composer require API platform, API pack, or API platform with a dash or without a dash. It's going to install the exact same set of packages. So API pack is something very special, and we have some packs, and I can have a look at all the packs that we have. So for instance, we have an ORM pack. So if I say composer require ORM, it knows that I want to work with Doctrine. This is the default. And that's something that comes with Flex. We make choices for you. Default ones. You might like them or not, but many people that don't like to have to do choices, they want us to make choices. To say, okay, the default, something that works well with Symfony is Doctrine, for instance. You can use something else, but if you're using Doctrine, it's going to work really well. Or if you want an admin generator, there are several of them, we make some choices for you. And we can change the default at some point, but we make some choices for you. So as you can see, when we install the ORM pack, it installs a bunch of dependencies coming from Doctrine. So you have the ORM and all the dependencies. And again, you have some configuration that was done automatically. And here, you can see something very interesting. Here, we have the Doctrine bundle that was installed, and we can see that we get a recipe from this repository. And actually, we have more than one repository for recipes. The one we talked about, this one, Symfony recipes, is really about the official recipes managed by the core team. So we are very, we don't accept all the contributions here. It should really be things that a large majority of the Symfony users need. So we have a bunch of them here. And then we have another one, which is recipes-contrib. And here, you can contribute whatever you want. Even if the code is crappy or whatever, we don't care. It is managed by the community. Of course, the code should be good enough. And I will talk about that in a minute. But here, it's much easier to register something. If you follow some simple rules, your recipe is going to be accepted. Basically, that's the way it works. And then there is a third way. So we have recipes contrib, and the last one is, as you can see here, I have Doctrine cache bundle. And it says that it configured this bundle from a generated recipe. So when you install a bundle and there is no recipe, and sometimes it makes sense that there is no recipe because you don't have to install anything, there is no configuration or whatever, then Flex is smart enough to guess that you are installing a bundle and you want to register the bundle. So you never, ever have to register a bundle. That's something from the past. If you have a look here, under the config directory, you have bundles.php, and that's where all the bundles are actually registered. And you can see the Doctrine cache bundle is registered here, even if I don't have any recipe for this specific bundle. Right? So this file is actually managed by Flex. You can add more if you want, but by default, Flex does the work for you. So we installed doctrine. And if we have a look at the makefile again, I think there is nothing more here. But if we have a look at the environment variables, you can see that we have a new section about the database URL stuff that is needed by doctrine. So it was installed, it was added to the file. And you can see as well here under packages, we have doctrine configuration. So talking a bit about the config directory, as you can see, we have many files. It's not like in Symfony 3 where you have one config file with everything in there. We have one file per bundle. And that makes sense because as those files are created by Flex directly, it's much easier to manage for Flex instead of trying to figure out where to add things under the existing sections of your config.yml files. It's even better because now if I say I don't want to work with the ORM anymore, I can remove the ORM. And then it's going to unconfigure things. So you can see that we unconfigure doctrine cache bundle and doctrine bundle. So if I go back here, you can see that the doctrine.yml file is not there anymore. And if I have a look at the end here, it's not there anymore as well. So Symfony Flex is able to configure dependencies, but it is also able to remove dependency when you don't need them anymore, which is nice because with Symfony Standard Edition, you get some dependencies. If you want to remove them, that's a lot of work. And if you want to add them, that's a lot of work as well because you need to read the documentation to know how to configure things properly. That's not the case with Symfony Flex. Everything is done automatically. And if I remove everything, not everything, but just the things that we installed, you can see that I have even less files, and the bin directory is not there anymore, and things like that. Okay. Now, let's go back to the keynote here, and I've talked about all the things here. Now, I wanted to talk a bit about some tips. How many of you were aware of Flex? How many of you already created one Flex project? Okay, cool. So those tips are things that I think you don't know about them because they are very recent changes or just because they are not well documented yet. So the first one is you should upgrade Flex on a regular basis because we are still changing the protocol. The protocol is stable, is very stable actually. We didn't change anything recently really, but we have some bugs of course, so upgrade Symfony Flex dependency on a regular basis. The last change that we did was for performance reasons. So the very first version was actually hitting the Symfony.sh server for each package. That's not the case anymore. Now we are doing just one request, get all the recipes, and install everything at the end. So it's much faster than it was before. So we talk about this one. Use aliases. So if you want to install monologue bundle, that's yet another example. You can say just require log. If you want to work with twig, you can say require twig or templating or template or whatever. That's a bunch of them here. Also, anything that is Symfony/something, you can just get rid of Symfony/. So when you say require something, we have a look at all the aliases, if there is one. If not, we check if this is a Symfony component, and if not, then we fall back to the default resolution from Composer. Use packs as much as possible. If there is a pack for something, use it because you're going to have a better configuration out of the box instead of adding all the dependencies individually, which means that if you want to remove the pack altogether, it's also much easier. Tip number 5, contribute recipes. That's very easy. It's very useful. So whenever you install something and there is no recipe, and you need to read the documentation to know how to configure things, well, if you think that the default configuration that you get from the documentation is good enough for, I would say, 90% of the use cases, then contribute a recipe so that the next time you create a project or the next time someone is creating a project with Symfony Flex, it's going to be much easier and much faster for him. So talking about contributing recipes, we have the Symfony bot, and the Symfony bot helps a lot. we have a lot of validation rules built in, which means that the review is mainly done by the bot. So for instance, here we are saying that a new file should end with a new line. We are checking a lot of things really to be sure that the recipe is good enough, and that works on the recipes repository and the recipes contrib repository as well. And then the bot validates things, and as you can see here, you can also test the recipe. Because you contribute a recipe, but you want to test that it works on a real project. So what you can do is you have your project, then you export the Symfony endpoint here at the bottom of the screen, and you get a URL which is really a staging server with all the recipes from the contrib and the official repository, plus your changes from your pull request, right? And then you can install the package that you are working on, and you can check that it actually works. Okay, and the merge is actually done automatically from the bot based on some rules. So basically, on the contrib repository, whenever someone says, yes, that's good, it's going to be merged. The official repository, you need 2 + 1 from the core team. So it's more strict. Symptom bundles don't need recipes because we can auto-register bundles. So if the only thing is registering a bundle, there is no need for a recipe. Oh, this one is kind of interesting. So we're going to try to do that. So if we go here, I want to install Algolia. It's not there because it's the contrib repository. So let's have a look at Algolia. This one, for instance. So this one is from the contrib repository. And if I say composer require this, okay, it installs a bunch of things. And here it tells me that it comes from the contrib repository. So by default, we don't install things from the contrib repository because they are not official. So we ask you the question, do you want to install or to execute the recipe from the contrib repository? So here you can say yes, just for this specific bundle. You can say no, no way. You can say yes for all the packages installed during this session, or you can say permanently, which means that now, whenever you install something coming from the contrib repository, you won't have the question anymore. And that's managed in the composer file. Here you can see there is an extra Symfony section, and here we have allow contrib set to true. You can switch back to false if you want to revert that. Okay. Environment variables, you can cast them. By default, an environment variable is really just a string. But as of Symfony 3.4, you can say, okay, the debug is really a Boolean. So you can cast them if you want. Right. App debug and app env. So environment variables are actually loaded by default by the web front controller, but also by the console, which means that you probably know those commands at the top where on the production environment you need to say, okay, I want to work with the production environment, I don't want to debug, or you can use also these environment variables. As of Symfony 4 or Symfony 3.3, if you are using Flex, you don't need to do that. When you say bin console, it knows that it needs to get the environment from the environment variables. So it just works. Right? There is no need to configure anything anymore. Environment variables work with PHP Unit as well. So you can see here there is a section under PHP where I have the exact same kind of things that I have in the .env environment. So if you want a different set of environment variables for your unit test, that's also possible like that, and that's also managed by Flex. The only thing is that you need to do that as early as possible. So here, I have required PHP Unit Bridge, but if you required PHP Unit, that would work as well. It would install the same thing. And then, so I was saying that you need to do that as early as possible, just because it is only able to manage this file if it exists, of course. If you don't install the PHP Unit Bridge, the file does not exist, which means that if you install SwiftMailer, for instance, it doesn't know, it can't add the section on PHP Unit. And then if you are installing PHP Unit Bridge right now, and we can probably fix that, it's not going to add the section for SwiftMailer. That's also new. So perhaps I can go back here. So under config, everything under packages is really the configuration for packages, not bundles, not just bundles. And a recipe is not just for bundles. It's also for a lot of components. So for instance, if you install PHP Unit, it's not a bundle, but there is a recipe for that. I know. I'm running out of time, right? OK. I'm almost done. So under packages, you have everything done by Flex. But of course, you can make changes if you want to. That's your files. You can see that there's a directory for dev and prod and test. And there is services.yml. I'm not going to talk about this one because Nicholas is going to talk about that this afternoon. But basically, that's where you can configure your own services. And sometimes you have some services that are different in the test environment or the development environment or production or whatever. So that's something you can do here now. And that's new by creating those files. That's how you can override templates. So we didn't talk about Twig, but templates are outside of the source directory. So now, under the source directory, that's only about your PHP code. So no configuration like services configuration, no templates, nothing. So there is a new template directory at the top level, and that's how you can configure, for instance, override the exception from Twig bundle. That's kind of new as well. If you're using Framework Extra Bundle, please use the 4.0 version, which is the master branch right now, because we don't have any stable version. And that's important because this is the first version that does not depend on the templating component. And the templating component is going to be deprecated at some point. So it's really Twig first now. So you need this version instead of the stable 3 version that's not going to work well. OK, so I was talking about that. If you want to learn more about a container, and the container is really the other big change for Symfony 4. So Flex is one of the big changes, and the container is really the next one. And you will see that's the exact same philosophy as with Flex. We are trying to help you get started faster, less configuration, less dependencies, less everything, really. And as a conclusion, so today, you need the Symfony installer to install or to create a new project. You need the Symfony Standard Edition with a bunch of stuff in there. You need the Sensor Distribution Bundle, and a few other things. All those things disappear in Symfony 4 because we don't need them anymore. They are automated for you, and I think that's a great step forward, and I hope that you're going to like it. And I really, really want you to test, to create a new Flex application, give some feedback, because we're going to stop adding new features by the end of the month, so at the end of next week. So it's the right time to test Flex. You will see it's really easy, and give some feedback about what works, what doesn't work, hopefully not that much, and things that we can tweak to make it even better. And I think that's all for today. Thank you.